Hi, this is Paul. Since the pandemic hit, or at least hit California, or at least hit the public consciousness of California, the first video I made, I talked about using this as a learning opportunity, and it will be. And things are sort of playing out as, well, if you're an observer of human nature, pretty much according to how human beings operate. And so I wanted to do a video. Thought about it last night. Pandemic Skeptics and the Day of the Lord. We'll see what I actually title it because things often change by the time I go through a video. So now, when I talk about, I get emails from people. Often people will then say, yeah, you mentioned me in your video. And it's like, yeah, I mentioned you and the other people who sent similar emails because if you think I'm talking about you, you're not the only one. Pandemic skeptics in terms of people who've sent me emails, more comments on Twitter, such and such. It even got the attention of the Wall Street Journal. Controlling the virus narrative. Besides all the other things that I do, I have a bunch of legacy things in my life, one of which is a moderator for a CRC pastors Facebook group. And someone posted a Medium article, which has since been taken down by Medium, detailing why this is a huge overreaction that's costing a lot of money and all that. And you've heard it before, and maybe they're right and maybe they're not. I thought it was interesting that Medium took the article down, and which is what the Wall Street Journal was noting, how, well, we've got some ideas about, well, as private companies like Google, like YouTube, like Medium, I suppose they can take down things that they want to, practice their own editorial discretion, I suppose. But there are plenty of pandemic skeptics out there. I think fewer than there were. I remember when this hit, talking to a good number of people who were basically just ignoring it when the early chatter was going about and paying more and more attention as it was. I listened to Chris Christie on This Week on ABC Sunday morning. I don't tape it. I have it on my DVR, but I always say tape it because I'm an old man. And Chris Christie, I thought, I always like listening to Chris Christie. I thought he had a good view of Trump. When I listened to Chris Christie talk about Trump, I think. And for a while, he was in the second phase was downplaying the seriousness. Oh, it's just a flu. And there are a lot of other people talking about that too. And then sort of getting on board with all the alarmism, depending on how you want to talk about it. And it's still going on. Just Joey from the meetup posted a thing on Twitter today, compiling a list of the official misinformation for the press and state. Now, I don't really know why Donald Trump and the press are that he hates and continues to squabble with at the press conference have suddenly formed an alliance. Maybe it's because Democrats and Republicans want to throw everything in the kitchen sink in a $2 billion stimulus package. And, that's not as hard to believe as Donald Trump coming to terms and coming to peace with the press over this stuff. But travel bans are overreactioning. Only Wuhan visitors at risk. Avoid handshaking is paranoid. Virus is contained. Tests are available. Masks won't help. What else? And then showing somebody in Spain talking about, in making a comment in February 14, how in Spain we do not have COVID-19. Now, unless all of this footage coming out of Italy and Spain, especially some of the stuff coming out of Italy, is sort of like the moon landing, and all of those coffins are just for show, and it's a worldwide conspiracy now that's trying to dupe us that people aren't really dying from this. Well, they do die over the seasonal flu too, and we don't have pictures of those, but it's obviously the rates of infection that people are concerned about. But still plenty of folks out there, and some of you watching this video, unless you've given up on my channel, because despite your emails and comments, I've refused to join Team Skeptic with respect to the COVID virus. Thing is, we believe in herds. And again, for me, this is a very good experiment in thought, because a month from now, 2 months from now, a year from now, 2 years from now, those of us who still remain alive, whether from flu or car accident or what have you, will our view of what happens now and our estimation of each other's ability to read the signals right will be changed by this, because we believe in herds. These are some ads, one of them from the mid-40s. More doctors smoke Camels, and you can see the word science liberally splattered throughout these advertisements, and how, well, Camel cigarettes are far safer than their other competing brands. And this one was my favorite, with this woman talking about, people are telling me that smoking brings low birth weight. Oh, that's an advantage. A skinny baby and an easier birth too. It's a win-win-win. And of course, we look at this today and say, this is horrendous. But this isn't that long ago. And of course, science was supposed to back it up. Now, there's a lot of fudging that goes on with respect to a whole lot of things in this world. So we watch each other for signals. And you have, again, we've talking about the narrative and the data. They're all always going back and forth, back and forth. We're checking our narratives with the data. Our narratives are shaping the data back and forth and back and forth. And of course, science is intended to eliminate the data narrative shaping, but it can't be completely eliminated, because the data that you are looking at is shaped by the narratives that you are living within. In the middle of this, I've been thinking about two books. One book that I had only partially read, from Alan Jacobs, The Year of Our Lord 1943, and I just reread the introduction to it and thought, yeah, I should dig into this book again. I'm, again, still listening to and reading too many books at once. But also thinking about George Marsden's excellent book, The Twilight of the American Enlightenment. And both authors made the point that in the 40s and 50s, the United States looked to Christian ministers for guidance. And when you think about that today, it seems very anachronistic. Another book that I've been reading, Andrew Root's, he's got two books right now on pastoring and post-modernity. Both, I haven't read the first book, but I'm reading the second book. It's really an excellent book. A lot of people would have problems with it, but it's really a good piece of work. But this quote from Alan Jacobs, The Year of Our Lord 1943, the unspoken question underlying all these explorations. So he's basically saying, at the beginning of the Second World War, as basically the old order of the kind of set up by Wilsonian Versailles, the Wilsonian progressivism, the Versailles Treaty in Europe, the catastrophic collapse of the market in the Great Depression, and then the rise of fascism. The unspoken question underlying all these explorations was the same. If the free societies of the West win this great war, how might their young people be educated in a way that made them worthy of that victory, and that made another war on that scale at worst avoidable and at best unthinkable? Of course, World War II would be followed by the Cold War, which, praise God, we didn't destroy the world with. Perhaps, though, we might say that there was one other point on which most of these thoughtful observers were agreed. Miseducation had left the ordinary citizens of Western democracies in the helpless thrall to the propagandist machinations of unscrupulous nationalist movements. In 1941, George Orwell had insisted, "One cannot see the modern world as it is unless one recognizes the overwhelming strength of patriotism, national loyalty. Christianity and international socialism are as weak as straw in comparison with it." Now, it's very interesting that, is international socialism still with us? Some would argue yes, some would argue no. Socialism, to me, still at a personal level seems to predictably bend to the influence and seductions of wealth. A lot of wealthy people love to be socialists when they have plenty of money, and everybody loves to be socialists in a crisis, it appears. Anyway, indeed, Hitler and Mussolini rose to power in their own countries very largely because they could grasp this fact, and their opponents could not. The thinkers whose ideas I describe in this book agree with Orwell on these points, but did not think he had described inevitable realities, but rather contingent and to some degree reversible ones. They thought it possible and necessary to restore Christianity to a central, if not dominant, role in the shaping of Western societies. Why they thought this was necessary, how they planned to achieve it, and what particular visions of Christianity moved them are the chief topics of this book. And one might argue that, in fact, all of their efforts failed. T.S. Eliot, C.S. Lewis, W.H. Auden, and a good number of other intellectuals during the war years, imagining they were setting out to reshape the Christian West. Reinhold Niebuhr, neo-orthodoxy, and in some ways, if we imagine they were successful for a season in the 50s, let's say, they might have been. And in that sense, that's where George Marsden's really excellent book picks up, The Twilight of the American Enlightenment, because George Marsden's book, picks up after the focus of 1943 here, and shows how it all sort of began to unravel then in the 60s and 70s. And in my conversation with Tom Holland, very much looking forward to seeing what he does with the 1960s and the counterculture in the role that played. Perhaps in the war years they were successful in setting up education, and perhaps they were successful in the fact that, again, in at least the United States, church attendance reached its peak in the period directly following the thoughts of these thinkers. Not just C.S. Lewis, T.S. Eliot, W.H. Auden, but also, of course, Reinhold Niebuhr, and really the architects of what would become the mainline church until its catastrophic slide that began in the 70s and 80s and have continued unarrested since then. So, in other words, throwing an olive branch of peace to the pandemic skeptics who enjoy and comment on my channel, I just want to say that, in my opinion, skeptics are welcome. You might not convince me. You might not colonize me anywhere as much as you'd like to colonize me, but contrarians are welcome, because I think actually contrarians in terms of human beings are a feature and not a bug. If you remember my cyclical stages of sense-making, skepticism is the first stage. When you hear someone promoting something, it's wise to be skeptical if it doesn't seem right to you, and test it and do your math. Now, everybody falls on a spectrum in that, and some people will be skeptics all the way through the pandemic and will remain skeptical, just as some continue to assert that the moon landing was a hoax. Perhaps it was. I tend to believe that Neil Armstrong was an honest man and wasn't just in on the great con. But then again, you might consider me a gullible sort, because I also believe in the bodily resurrection of Jesus Christ. So there's that. So skepticism is an important thing. Skepticism in a community of interpretation is actually a valuable thing. One of the things that we noticed early on in our Jordan Peterson meetups was that our meetups were full of people who tested like 0 in agreeableness. And a bunch of people said, I didn't know you could test that low. That's how disagreeable some of our Jordan Peterson people are now. It's interesting to watch them now with this new wave of believing going through. A fair number of people I know are climate skeptics, but they believe in the pandemic. So, but you've still got some holdouts out there too. Sense making is, of course, narrative and data in a reiterative process. We're always going through it. We're always watching the signals. Now, of course, there's a lot of reinforcement going on in there, reinforcing our biases. So, of course, we're sort of believing the news that's in alignment with our narrative and disbelieving the news that isn't in alignment with our narrative. And now in our siloed news sources via the internet, we're preferring those who are in alignment with us and turning a back against those who want. Then, of course, there are all those red pill moments when something happens and we radically switch. maybe someone got sick, or maybe Donald Trump will come out and say, nah, this was all a big con just to pass $2 trillion of stimulus and we just threw everything in the kitchen sink in so that Democrats and Republicans would vote for it. Could it be the big con? Is Italy in on the con? Most of us don't really believe the Chinese too much, and I think wisdom dictates that. But this is all sense-making, and this is what we're doing. Skepticism, alarm, adjustment, sustainability. You make sense of the data with the narrative. You can't understand the data with the narrative. If your narrative goes off without too much data, you're in trouble there too. And of course, there are lots of different skeptics. There are climate skeptics. There are skeptics who don't believe that Donald Trump is a very stable genius and that, he's doing a great job. And then there are skeptics about Biden's health. And just like there are skeptics about Hillary's health. There are second coming skeptics. That this whole second coming thing that Christians believe in, who can believe that? And find a community of narrative belief, and you will find skeptics. That's, again, I think this is a feature of human beings and not a bug. Communities are, of course, created by narrative beliefs, and it's all that shaping of data and beliefs and all the community dynamics that make these things. Now, one of my favorite stories in the Old Testament testifies to this. King Ahab of the northern kingdom of Israel and King Jehoshaphat of the southern kingdom of Judah, they were going to go to war. So, of course, in that time, you ask your prophets. And, of course, you have all these court prophets. And, well, kings quite famously don't like to hear things they don't like to hear. And so that kind of tailors the court prophets in a certain direction. So the king of Israel brought together the prophets, about 400 men, and asked them, shall I go to war against Ramoth Gilead, or shall I refrain? Go, they answered, for the king will give it into the king's hands. Jehoshaphat, the other king, a little skeptical. But Jehoshaphat asked, is there no longer a prophet of the Lord, the God that was in favor down in the southern kingdom, whom we can inquire of? The king of Israel answered Jehoshaphat, there is still one prophet, through whom we can inquire of the Lord, but I hate him because he never prophesies anything good about me, but always bad. He is Micaiah, son of Imlah. Jehoshaphat replied, the king should not say such a thing. That's not wisdom. It's important to keep your skeptics around. It's important to listen to the opposing side. It's important to evaluate what they have to say. In terms of your consciousness, Congress, leave a little room for the loyal opposition who's a little bit skeptical about what they hear, and just keep that in the back of your mind. Don't kill that thing off too quickly. So then the king of Israel called one of his officials and said, bring Micaiah, son of Imlah, at once. And of course, if you want to know the rest of the story, the Bible is very easily found on the internet. We like to hear what we want to hear. Hearing what we don't like is an exercise in truth-finding, however, so keep the skeptics around. Corruption is giving in to your epistemic biases, and it might cost you your life. But then you think about this, and if you're paying attention to this, you might ask, what is your life anyway? Does being quarantined with your family mean an end to your life? I'm not living unless I'm blank. Watch your language. I've been reading Ross Douthat. Maybe I'm learning to say this. Ross Douthat's The Decadent Society. And like many other things, reading it now in a post, see, we're going to have to get names for all this stuff. A post-shutdown California is very interesting because Ross does a fair amount of hand-wringing about how will decadence end? Well, now in the middle of this, we're wondering, is decadence ending? Until late February, it was the new business as usual, which was obviously different after at least felt different after the 2016 election and the rise of Donald Trump. Now we're fearing millions of deaths worldwide. Hopefully, some of the measures will take action. But again, part of what I continue to ask us to do is watch ourselves in this moment. What do we think is going to happen? And then remember ourselves in this moment 2, 3 weeks, a month from now, and look back at ourselves with honesty. Did I call it right? Did I do the right thing? Because this is how we gain wisdom. Mass shelters at home orders. Italy can't burn bodies fast enough. I remember in the early days of Wuhan seeing a note about all of the emissions coming out of Wuhan that people were imagining wasn't just burning animals, was probably burning bodies. Trillions of dollars in bailout spending. Is that going to get through Congress? Are both sides going to basically fill it with whatever they want to? How will that work? How will anybody in the future ever say, well, we have to raise taxes to pay for the pandemic? Maybe deficits are meaningless now. Douthat talks about that in his book. How will this all look in March 2021? I don't intend on taking down any of these videos, just like I don't intend on taking down any video I've ever made so far, so feel free to go back and say, Vanderklay got it wrong. Vanderklay gets a lot wrong. If you don't believe me, ask my wife. But I wanted to talk about the day of the Lord, because this comes up in the book of Joel, and it's a very handy concept. It's a very important theme throughout the Bible, because what many of us perhaps are, perhaps aren't. The skeptics, not so much, unless, of course, the economy tanks, and then it'll all be Trump's fault for giving in to all the liberals that believed in the pandemic, or however you want to slice this. The day of the Lord is an interesting thing, and it starts in the book of Joel. In the book of Joel, maybe I'll read a little bit of the book of Joel. Yeah, okay, we can use, Microsoft has a nice new browser out. I installed the new version of Edge. The word of the Lord came to the son of Joel, son of Pethuel. Hear this, you elders. Listen, all you who live in the land. Has anything like this ever happened in your days, or in the days of your ancestors? Tell it to your children, and let your children tell it to their children, and their children to the next generation. What the locust swarm had left, the great locusts have eaten. What the great locusts have left, the young locusts have eaten. What the young locusts have left, other locusts have eaten. Wake up, you drunkards, and weep. Wail, all you drinkers of wine. Wail because of the new wine, for it was snatched from your lips. A nation has invaded my land, a mighty army without number. Now here, is he talking about locusts? Is he talking about an army? What's he talking about? A nation has invaded my land, a mighty army without numbers. It has teeth of a lion, the fangs of a lioness. It has laid waste my vines and ruined my fig trees. It has stripped off their bark and thrown it away, leaving their branches white. Mourn like a virgin in sackcloth, grieving for the betrothed of her youth. Grain offerings and drink offerings are cut off from the house of the Lord. The priests are in mourning, those who minister before the Lord. The fields are ruined, the ground is dried up, the grain is destroyed, the new wine dried up, and olive oil fails. Despair, you farmers, wail, you vine growers. Grieve for the wheat and the barley, because the harvest of the field is destroyed. The vine is dried up, and the fig tree is withered, the pomegranate and the palm tree and the apple tree. All the trees of the field are dried up. Surely the people's joy is withered away. Put on sackcloth, you priests, and mourn. Wail, you who minister before the altar. Come spend the night in sackcloth, you who minister before my God, for the grain offerings and the drink offerings are withheld from the house of your God. Declare a holy fast, call a sacred assembly, summon the elders and all who live in the land to the house of the Lord your God, and cry out to the Lord. Alas, for that day, the day of the Lord. For the day of the Lord is near. It will come like destruction from the Almighty. Has not the food been cut off before our very eyes? Joy and gladness from the house of our God. The seeds are shriveled beneath the clods. The storehouses are in ruins. The granaries have been broken down, for the grain has dried up. How the cattle moan, the herds mill about, because they have no pasture. Even the flocks of sheep are suffering. To you, O Lord, I call, for fire has devoured the pastures in the wilderness, and flames have burned up all the trees of the field. Even the wild animals pant for you. The streams of waters have dried up, and fire has devoured the pastures in the wilderness. The day of the Lord is not just a day. It's not just a final day. It can be individual. It happens when the doctor says you have cancer. It happens when you get the phone call that there's been a terrible accident with loss of life or health. It happens when you lose your job. The day of the Lord is an apocalypse. It's a revelation. What is revealed in us is where we've put our trust, what we have finally hoped in, what we have described, and what we have finally decided is our life. It can be communal. It can be individual. I describe it as a pre-echo of the final conclusion of human history. The day of the Lord. The funny thing about the day of the Lord is nobody expects the Spanish Inquisition. Nobody expects the day of the Lord. It comes upon us and we are shocked. We thought we had our bases covered. We thought we had enough money in the bank. We thought we had sword, famine, and pandemic beaten. Now, the videos that I've put out, I had the rough draft on Friday. I just used my rough draft for the Sunday sermon on Sunday. And the video that I put out on Monday was is the pandemic the judgment of God? Who sinned? Whose sin brought on this pandemic? Thanks, Roger Marshall, for the grammar correction. Because the Bible, well, the day of the Lord is the day of God's coming. It's when, now we can put this in fancy Vervaekian terms, it's when suddenly being itself impinges upon us and we realize exactly what and who we are, that we are frail, that we are but, as the author of Ecclesiastes says, we are but breath. Vanity of vanities, that is what we are. And so is the pandemic the judgment of God? And Mike from our meetup on Facebook said, all atheists say no. And I want to say to Mike, it depends on what you mean by God. God is a useful shorthand. God is the sum total of what the universe delivers to you. God number one and God number two in Jordan Peterson's talk with Sam Harris. Probably part of what's really helpful about Sam Harris's revelation is that what has happened in the Christian community is the domestication of God number two. In this way, we find the God of the Bible unimaginable, the God we can't begin to describe, not like the God that the prophet Joel would talk about. Oh, of course, we bless the Old Testament, but we don't want to read it. And so perhaps we can use the celebrity atheists quite well in this and shaking off the domesticated vision of God number two. God isn't moral enough, complains Sam Harris. God isn't nice enough. God is like a president that cowers in fear of losing popularity. That's not the God that you find in the book of Joel. God is the kind of parent that lives in fear that their 2-year-old will be upset with them. My child said he didn't love me anymore. That's not the kind of God you find in the Bible. God number two, as God number two expanded, as God number one receded, God number two became a reflection of what we thought was nice and good in our very domesticated times, when we imagine that, well, government can surely take care of all of this. Economics can surely take care of all of this. Science can surely take care of all of this. And just to forestall the inevitable comments, yes, I do believe the Chinese could have nipped this in the bud. Yes, I do believe they try to cover up. This is part of the reason that sin and calamity will always come together, because people do what people do reliably and predictably. And what the Chinese did, what many others have done in terms of all of the ways that they've behaved badly, says a lot. Now, it also says a lot that We're very Christian in many of the ways that we think about. We think, no, you shouldn't hoard. No, it shouldn't be every man or woman or child for themselves. No, it shouldn't be each of us doing our thing. We should be thinking about the community. We should be thinking about each other. Now, this may very well bring on a crisis of the state. In both of Harari's books, he noted that in many ways, states have expanded to make God unnecessary, as it were. And in many of my older videos, I talked about the fact that it's a long dominant theme in the Bible. Didn't get a chance to talk to Tom Holland as much about empire and the history of empire as I would have liked to. And I thought Harari and Sapiens dealt with it in an interesting way. Because empires, even though you sacrifice the diversity of all the little kingdoms and all the little languages, empires are created and we like them for good reason, because they have immense power, and this power can be wielded to do a tremendous amount of good things. In fact, as I mentioned in my piece yesterday, Daniel 7 and the Son of Man is one who is given an eternal empire as it's such. Even Jesus has an empire, it appears. States and empires are, in the Bible, often seen as rivals to God. States replace family and church relationships as social backstops. States are our heads against the big three. And again, I noted in the beginning of Homo Deus, the big three of famine, plague, and war. If you search for that triplet, if you search for that triplet in the Bible, you'll find that, Harari knows his Bible, because those three are often put together: famine, plague, and war. Well, famine, we've had many, many fat years. War, we avoided nuclear holocaust. We've had how many years of war in Afghanistan? But plague, we thought we had that one beaten. And now, of course, no, we didn't have it beaten. And again, I might as well be candid about what I think. I find the press enormously annoying in this time. Why couldn't you have imagined? Yeah. We all know it. It's the day of the Lord. It comes upon us. And it's the light coming on, and we are revealed to be what we are. The day always comes. It came, of course, in the Second World War. During World War II, the great fear was nationalism. Nationalism is the enemy. And, of course, today it's globalism versus nationalism. And Alan Jacobs talks about that in his book. And it's the one lens. Now, suddenly, we all want globalism, and we all want centralized structures, and, until, of course, we don't. Right now, who will tell us what 2021 looks like? This pandemic could radically alter life going forward. It could be a blip, and in 2021, we're sort of going back to business as usual. In 2021, we'll either have the same president or a different president. 2021, none of us know what it brings. Again, when we look at Italy, it makes us anxious. It makes us fearful. Will what rolled out in Italy happen in the United States, happen in the UK, happen in Australia? We don't know. The day of the Lord comes upon us like a thief in the night. The day of the Lord comes, and the world changes. Well, what is the world? Is it just that data? Is it just that science? No. Notice, for some people, their world has changed because all they can think of is this pandemic. For other people, the skeptics walk around, but the world will change when Congress starts mailing out checks and passing a $2 trillion aid package, and on and on. And maybe by this point, a new thing will happen. We don't know. Well, that's the conclusion. It's not a terribly satisfying conclusion, but I guess the two main points. Skeptics, welcome. If you want to send me an email telling me why I'm wrong on the pandemic, I mentioned to one person, I said, now he knows I am talking about him. I mentioned to one person, I said, I just a pastor of a little church. I'm not making big decisions. He says, yeah, but you have people listening to you on YouTube. So there you go. I'm spoiling you all with my influence of being a a pandemic believer. But if you're a pandemic skeptic, go ahead and write it in the comments. Send me an email. I'm way behind on emails. I'll warn you that, because I've just been making a lot of phone calls, and the family, I've got extra people in the household, so figuring out food for everybody, and it's just been a busy, busy time since the pandemic hit. Physically, I'm well. Hasn't come to me yet. We'll see what happens in California, but yeah, skeptics welcome. But at the same time, the day of the Lord comes, and it comes to all of us, and it comes to each of us. It can come in big ways, and it can come in little ways, but it does come. And so work your narrative data cycle. Try and find out the truth. Work real hard to know the truth, but the day of the Lord does come. None of us escape it.